The reason for Trump's leniency toward Putin is that he thinks he's Putin's friend. He likes Putin. He thinks Putin likes him. I don't think that's how Putin sees it at all. Conspiracy theories out there about what the Epstein scandal represented. So he's prepared to give away almost anything if he thinks he can make a deal. He doesn't want to apply pressure on Putin because, as I said before, Putin's his friend, and he doesn't want to wreck the friendship.
Hello everyone, my name is Alex and today we are joined by a very special guest, a former US National Security Advisor, a long-time foreign policy expert and US Ambassador to the United Nations, John Bolton. Thank you for joining us today, Mr. John.
Well, glad to be with you.
Mr. Bolton, you said it is a mystery why Trump, who once loudly decried corruption, is now blocking the full release of Epstein files if he is innocent. As a former national security advisor, say it plainly, does Trump's behavior look like that of a person who is being blackmailed? Is there a possibility that within these missing 3 million files there is a compromise of such magnitude that it makes the US president vulnerable to external control?
Well, a lot of people have been puzzled by Trump's changes on the whole Epstein affair. That, as you say, during the campaign, he said he would make everything publicly available, and that the failure to do so until then showed that there was a conspiracy of the elites in Washington. There were all kinds of conspiracy theories out there about what the Epstein scandal represented. And then when he became president, he changed his view and said this should go away. It's not much of an issue, which was really devastating, particularly to his own political base, because they were the people who really accepted the idea that the whole thing showed corruption in the judicial system. And Trump has repeatedly reaffirmed that he thinks there's nothing there, to the point where people are saying, well, maybe he's an Israeli agent, Epstein's an Israeli agent, maybe he's a Russian agent, maybe Trump does have something to hide. Honestly, even with the files that have been released, I don't think anybody has made a credible case that Trump himself did anything wrong. So is he trying to cover up for his friends, or what exactly is going on? To me, and I think many other people, it's still a mystery why he engaged in, why Trump really did a self-inflicted political wound, which he continues to do. So the files are still being reviewed. More files apparently have to be produced. This could go on for quite some time. It's all having a negative political impact on Trump, which is the continuing reason why I at least don't understand it.
We know that Epstein trafficked in influence and information. Trump is now strangely indulging Putin while ignoring violations of the ceasefire. Do you allow for the possibility that the Epstein archives may contain not just sordid personal material, but evidence of Trump's ties to Russian money or influence via Epstein as an intermediary? Could fear of such exposure be the reason for the softness Trump is showing toward the Kremlin?
Well, look, anything could be in those files, that's for sure. But on the other hand, they were in the possession of the Biden Justice Department for years. Nothing of that sort leaked out. If you have even a slightly cynical perspective, you would say, well, if the Biden administration had found it, we would have heard about it. But we did not. I think that unfortunately the reason for Trump's leniency toward Putin is that he thinks he's Putin's friend. He likes Putin. He thinks Putin likes him. I don't think that's how Putin sees it at all. I think he's as cold-blooded as anybody I've ever met, and I think the real success is that Putin has been able to put his KGB training to good work on Trump. And it's nothing mysterious. The KGB trained, and I'm sure the FSB and the SVR are still trained to identify their targets' weaknesses and then to exploit them. And that's what Putin has done very successfully with Trump, and it's entirely possible he did it without any compromise at all.
Trump has said he feels not very good about the prospect of testimony on Epstein in Congress. Stripping away diplomacy, do you think we were seeing not just political maneuvering, but an attempt to conceal a criminal conspiracy at the highest level? And if Democrats do take the House of Representatives, could the Epstein case become the factor that finally destroys Trump's legacy and possibly exposes his true dependence on foreign actors, including Putin?
Well, we'll have to see what evidence they can uncover. I think one reason he's unhappy about public testimony, particularly of former President Clinton, is that Republicans have now established a precedent that they can get a former president to come up and testify on something that may or may not have had anything to do with what he was doing when he was in office. I do think it's correct that if the Democrats gain control of the House of Representatives, which I think at this point most political analysts believe they will, that there will be unending investigation of the first 2 years of the second Trump term on corruption, like with cryptocurrency and transactions by the Trump family business and a whole range of other things. It's going to be a very painful last 2 years for Trump in that eventuality, and even more painful if the Democrats get control of the Senate, which I think is unlikely, but still possible. And so in the midst of all these investigations, I wouldn't predict at the moment that the Epstein issue would be at the center. It would certainly be a part of it, though.
Mr. Ambassador, you have said that Trump is willing to take Putin at his word in order to appear to be a successful negotiator. We are now witnessing the complete collapse of his so-called one-week ceasefire. Russia's not only resumed its strikes, but also cynically claimed that the ceasefire has been falsified, accusing Ukraine of this violation and of destroying a thermal power plant in Kiev. Isn't Trump's silence in the face of this lie proof that his own ego matters more than him in reality? And what is the point of his security guarantees at all if Putin can wipe his feet on them on the third day, blame the victim, and Trump will swallow it just to avoid admitting failure?
I think it's unquestionably true. Trump is not pursuing some strategy for American national security in dealing with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. He doesn't care about NATO security, doesn't care about Ukraine security, cares about himself. So it is, I think, an important question to ask. If Trump really won't even commit unequivocally to following Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty and the NATO alliance, who could put any security in words that he might say in a ceasefire deal involving Ukraine? And I think this is very important. People who talk a lot about the rules-based international order act as if you write something down and sign it. Well, that solves the problem. It certainly doesn't solve the problem for Vladimir Putin, and unfortunately, it doesn't solve it for Trump either. He's entirely capable the day after signing that kind of agreement of just ignoring it, which is why I've been in a minority in thinking that this focus on a ceasefire is not necessarily in Ukraine's interest. It's a matter that turns over 20% of the country to Russia. I think once a ceasefire line is drawn, it's very hard to change it except by force. It gives the Russians breathing room to rebuild their army, rebuild their economy, and they'll be back in 3 or 4 or 5 years, just as they tried first in 2014 and then again in 2022. They'll come back again. The security guarantee won't deter them.
You have said that Putin is convinced of his victory through a war of attrition and may even believe that Trump has already promised him the Donbass. If Trump is truly unwilling to apply hard power and real pressure, Is there any scenario at all in which this White House can force Putin to stop? Or are we now watching a situation in which Putin is simply waiting to Trump hand over under Ukraine under guise of a compromise? Because, as you have said, Trump doesn't care what happens 2 or 3 years after an agreement is signed.
Well, I think it's becoming increasingly obvious that the Alaska summit produced something that the Russians found acceptable, and that they're now irritated isn't being delivered to them. I suspect it's the territorial concessions in the Donbass. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov just gave an interview within the past day or so where he all but says that again. And I think that's one reason that Trump is afraid to apply real pressure to Russia. That he did make that concession, which would be disastrous if true, and he's very much afraid that if he reverses his course, the Russians will make the whole thing public, and then he'd have real difficulty. Look, this puts enormous difficulty in the way of people in the United States who support Ukraine's efforts to maintain its freedom and independence. Obviously, the president has control of foreign policy, but there's enormous support in Congress. And what we find ourselves doing, I think, is following the lead of the Europeans, who keep saying we can negotiate this ceasefire. And I think people need to reflect on whether that really is in Ukraine's strategic interest, particularly for the next 3 years while Trump is still president.
Regarding the talks in Abu Dhabi, you noted that Trump's team is currently being pulled in opposite directions by Iran and Israel, and that Ukraine is a problem they want to close as quickly as possible. Is there a risk in Abu Dhabi Trump will try to impose a quick peace at the expense of Ukraine territory solely to add a line to his resume for the Nobel Peace Prize? And do you think that Putin is deliberately playing on Trump's vanity by agreeing to negotiations, using the time to regroup before a new offensive, just as you predicted?
Well, I think Putin is doing everything he can to avoid being blamed when the talks break down, which they will, and which I think they have in Abu Dhabi. There may be another meeting scheduled, but I don't anticipate it will change. But Putin is able to say, look, I continue to be willing to negotiate. It's these Ukrainians who are being unreasonable. I don't think the Iran issue necessarily plays into that, although we know from Trump's own comments that the readout of his last phone conversation with Putin, that Putin offered to be a mediator with respect to Iran, which would be another disaster. I do think you're correct to say that what's really motivating Trump is the Nobel Peace Prize. So to get that, he needs a deal that brings the conflict in Ukraine to at least a temporary halt. And he doesn't care what the deal is. He doesn't understand really what's at stake. He doesn't see the U.S. has anything at stake. So he's prepared to give away almost anything if he thinks he can make a deal. He doesn't want to apply pressure on Putin because, as I said before, Putin's his friend, and he doesn't want to wreck the friendship. Putin sees that, and he just pushes Trump as far as he thinks he can move him, usually successfully. Sometimes he's overreached, but usually he gets exactly what he wants.
Today on our program, we're joined by a very, very, very special guest, a former U.S. National Security Advisor, a long-time foreign policy expert, and former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Mr. John Bolton. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks again for having me.
And finally, I would like to express my gratitude to all my subscribers and viewers, especially those who help improve my content and make it much higher quality, as well as those who consistently support me in the comments with your brilliant support, your brilliant kind words. I would especially like to thank my sponsor, Morgan Lamb, for the most powerful sponsorship support. Thank you, buddy. Go Ukraine, and long live hockey.